They thought it was a vitamin. It turned out to be the fuel of genocide. In the spring of 1940, the German military placed a logistical order that had nothing to do with bullets, fuel, or bread. The order was for 35 million small white tablets to be distributed across 3 branches of the armed forces within 10 weeks. The tablets were not painkillers, they were not vitamins. Each one contained methamphetamine, and every single pill was meant to be swallowed by a soldier before he went to war. 35 million in 10 weeks. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. That number alone should stop everything. But the number is only the beginning, because those pills didn't just move through the bodies of individual soldiers. They moved through the structure of an entire military campaign, bending what was physically possible, erasing the wall between a human being and a machine, and helping produce one of the fastest and most devastating military conquests in recorded history. France fell in 46 days. Military historians have argued about that number for decades. Some point to tactics, some point to leadership failures on the Allied side. Almost none of them, until very recently, pointed to chemistry. The soldiers crossing the Ardennes forest in May 1940 hadn't slept in 3 days. Not because they were ordered not to sleep, because they couldn't. Their minds were running at a frequency that made rest feel like an insult. Panzer crews who should have been exhausted past the point of function were loading shells and reading maps and pushing forward through the night as if the darkness were nothing at all. Allied commanders receiving field reports about German troop movements that made no tactical sense, units advancing at speeds that seemed to violate the limits of human endurance, didn't know what they were looking at. They thought it was a mistake in the intelligence. It wasn't. What those Allied commanders didn't know, and what most of the world wouldn't know for decades, was that the German military had essentially chemically altered the baseline of what a soldier could endure. Now pull back even further. While those soldiers were moving through Belgium and France on 3 days without sleep, a man in Berlin was receiving an injection he hadn't asked for. He was 51 years old, increasingly unwell, and surrounded by physicians who competed for his trust the way courtiers compete for a king's favour. One of those physicians, a round-faced, unassuming man who had originally trained as a skin doctor, had quietly become the most powerful medical practitioner in the Third Reich, not because of his skill, but because of what he kept in his bag. His patient trusted him completely. His patient never asked what was in the needle. After the injection, the fog always lifted. The certainty always returned. That was enough. That patient was Adolf Hitler. The physician was Dr. Theodor Morell. And what he was injecting into the most powerful man in Europe was, among other things, a derivative of the same molecule pressed into those 35 million white tablets. This is not a story about addiction in the conventional sense, the slow degradation of a person who made bad choices. This is something more unsettling than that. This is the story of a molecule that was born in a laboratory as a cure, embraced by a civilization as a solution, written into the supply chains of a war machine as a tool, and administered to a dictator as a maintenance drug, all while the people making each of those decisions believed, at the time of making them, that they were doing something reasonable. The drug had a name, Pervitin, and almost no one outside of Germany knew it existed. In the autumn of 1939, a 26-year-old Wehrmacht physician named Ernst Langen arrived at a forward medical station somewhere outside Warsaw with 2 things he hadn't expected to be carrying: a standard-issue medical kit and a separate sealed container of small white pills that had been added to his supplies without any verbal explanation. The written instructions were brief. The pills were to be distributed to soldiers before extended operations. 1 pill was sufficient, 2 pills were the maximum. The reason for the upper limit was not explained. Langen had heard of Pervitin before. He had taken it himself as a medical student in Berlin once, during the final week before examinations when sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. A professor had mentioned it the way one might mention coffee, casually, without ceremony, as a practical tool for a practical problem. It had worked. The exam had gone well. He had filed the experience away without particular significance. Standing in Poland in the rain, holding a container of pills he was about to distribute to men who were going to cross into combat, he noticed something he hadn't considered during that quiet exam week in Berlin. The instruction sheet listed the maximum dose. It said nothing about what happened if a man kept taking them after the operation ended. He distributed the pills. He watched the men take them. And then something happened that he would spend the next several years trying to explain, and the years after that trying to forget. The question of how a pharmaceutical company's product ends up at the center of the largest war in human history is not a simple one. It doesn't begin with a general or a dictator or a battlefield. It begins, like most catastrophes, somewhere much quieter, in a laboratory, in a moment of genuine scientific optimism, in the hands of a man who thought he had found something useful. But that comes later. What matters right now in this opening moment is a single image. 35 million pills moving through the supply lines of an army preparing to invade Western Europe, and not one soldier in the line being told what he was actually swallowing. How does something like that happen? Berlin, 1937. The city was in the middle of transforming itself, not gradually, the way cities usually change, but with the deliberate, aggressive speed of a state that had decided what it wanted to look like and was eliminating everything that didn't fit. Construction cranes stood over half the major boulevards. New government buildings were going up in stone and marble. The Olympic Games had come and gone the previous year, and the infrastructure built for them was still being absorbed into the city's bones. Everything moved fast. Everything was supposed to move fast. Productivity wasn't just an economic value in Germany in 1937. It was a political one. Inside a pharmaceutical laboratory in the Tempelhof district, a chemist named Friedrich Hauschild was working on a problem that had nothing to do with politics. The problem was fatigue. Not fatigue as a medical condition, fatigue as a national inconvenience. German industry was running at a pace that human biology wasn't designed to sustain. Factory workers were pulling double shifts. Engineers were designing weapon systems on timelines that assumed their designers didn't need rest. The state was accelerating, and the bodies inside it were struggling to keep up. Several pharmaceutical companies had already been working on stimulant compounds for years. The science wasn't new. Amphetamine had been synthesized in 1887 and rediscovered for clinical use in the early 1930s. What Hauschild was attempting was more specific. A version of the molecule that could be pressed into a tablet, swallowed without a needle, absorbed quickly, and dosed reliably. He succeeded in 1937. The compound he produced was methamphetamine, a molecule already known to chemists but never before packaged with this kind of commercial intention. Hauschild worked for the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company, and Temmler moved quickly. The drug was named Pervitin. By 1938, it was on pharmacy shelves across Germany, available without a prescription, packaged in a small round tin that fit in a coat pocket. The label described it as a remedy for fatigue and low mood. The price was modest. The instructions were simple. No one called it methamphetamine. The word wouldn't have meant anything to most people anyway. To understand why Pervitin spread the way it did, it helps to understand what methamphetamine actually does to a human brain. Not in clinical language, but in plain terms. The brain runs on a chemical called dopamine. Dopamine is released when something good happens, when a person eats, rests, connects with another person, solves a problem. It creates the sensation of reward, of rightness, of capacity. Under normal circumstances, dopamine is released in measured amounts, and the brain reabsorbs it after it has done its work, maintaining a balance that keeps a person functional without burning through its own reserves. Methamphetamine destroys that balance in a single dose. It forces the brain to flood itself with dopamine, not the ordinary trickle of a good meal or a solved equation, but a torrent that the brain has no natural mechanism for producing on its own. At the same time, it blocks the reabsorption process, so the dopamine stays in the system far longer than it should. The result, in plain experience, is a sensation of complete capability. Tiredness vanishes, hunger disappears, uncertainty, that quiet, nagging voice that tells a person they might be wrong, might be overwhelmed, might need to stop, goes silent. A person on methamphetamine doesn't feel invincible in an irrational way. They feel functional, competent, calm in a way that seems, from the inside, entirely earned. That is what made it dangerous, not the high, the convincingness of the high. In 1938, a Munich housewife named Clara Brenner went to see her doctor about exhaustion. She was 29 years old, managing a household largely alone while her husband Heinrich worked extended hours at a machine parts factory. She had 2 young children. She'd been waking at 5 in the morning for 2 years and falling asleep sitting upright at the kitchen table by 9 in the evening. Her doctor, a practical, overworked man with a waiting room that was never empty, listened to her describe her symptoms for approximately 4 minutes. Then he wrote her a prescription. The prescription was for Pervitin. He explained that it was new, that it worked well, that several of his other patients had reported excellent results. He told her to take 1 tablet in the morning with water. He did not tell her what was in it. She didn't ask. Why would she? He was her doctor. Clara picked up the tin at the pharmacy on her way home. The next morning she took the first pill. By 8 o'clock that morning she'd cleaned the kitchen, washed and hung 2 loads of laundry, written 3 letters she had been putting off for weeks, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, that the day was something she was moving through rather than something moving over her. She would take Pervitin every morning for the next 14 years. The Temler Company did not hide what Pervitin was. There was no conspiracy at the point of origin, no deliberate concealment of a dangerous compound beneath an innocent label. The drug was exactly what the company said it was, a stimulant, effective against fatigue, manufactured to a consistent standard and sold at a fair price. The medical literature of the period discussed methamphetamine's properties with the same tone used to discuss aspirin's properties. Some early papers noted the possibility of psychological dependence. Those papers were not suppressed. They were simply not prominent. They sat in journals read by specialists, while the tins moved off pharmacy shelves by the hundreds of thousands. By 1939, an estimated 2 to 3 million Germans were taking Pervitin on a regular basis. It was available in chocolate form, small foil-wrapped tablets sold in boxes labelled as energy chocolates, marketed without specific medical framing. Department stores carried them, mail-order catalogues listed them. A soldier's mother, reading a women's magazine in early 1939, could find a half-page advertisement for Pervitin describing it as suitable for housewives who need to stay alert. Ernst Langen, still a medical student in Berlin, took his first Pervitin during the winter examination period of 1938. He took a single pill on the recommendation of a professor who described it as a reasonable study aid, in the same tone he might use to recommend a second cup of coffee. The night that followed was unlike any examination night Langen had experienced before, not euphoric, not chaotic, but steady, clear. He read 200 pages of pharmacology notes and retained them. In the morning he felt slightly flat, slightly hollow, as if something had been used up. He noted this sensation carefully. Then he passed his examinations, graduated, and was commissioned as a medical officer in the Wehrmacht. He packed a tin of Pervitin in his kit alongside his stethoscope. He thought of it the way he thought of morphine or sulfur powder, a tool appropriate for specific situations, requiring professional judgment in its application. He would spend years learning how wrong that comparison was. What no one in Germany in 1938 or 1939 fully grasped, not the physicians prescribing it, not the soldiers receiving it, not the housewives taking it with their morning water, was that the sensation of capability Pervitin produced was not free. The dopamine it flooded through the brain had to come from somewhere. The brain's reserves were finite. Every dose drew against a balance that could not be infinitely replenished. The first dose felt like discovery. The second felt like returning to baseline. By the 20th dose, baseline no longer existed without the pill. The body doesn't announce this transition. There is no moment when a person feels themselves cross a line. The line is invisible. It is only visible in retrospect when the person tries to stop and discovers that the thing they thought was helping them function has become the only reason they can function at all. Clara Brenner didn't know this in 1938. Her doctor didn't know it either. Or, if he suspected it, the suspicion wasn't strong enough to change anything he did. Friedrich Hauschild, the chemist who synthesized Pervitin in a Tempelhof laboratory, knew something of it. The dependency risk was acknowledged in the scientific literature he worked from, but dependency was a long-term concern, a chronic use concern. The immediate results were extraordinary. The immediate results were what the country needed. And in the autumn of 1938, with Germany moving toward a war it had been preparing for years, the question of what the country needed was about to change in scale entirely. The military had noticed what Pervitin did to a person who took it. They had questions, very specific questions, and they had already begun designing the experiments to answer them. The man who turned Pervitin into a military instrument wasn't a general. He wasn't a politician. He was a physiologist named Otto Ranke, and in 1938 he ran a small, underfunded research institute in Berlin called the Institute for General and Defense Physiology, a title that sounded bureaucratic and accomplished very little until Ranke got his hands on a tin of Pervitin and began asking a question no civilian doctor had thought to ask. Not whether it worked. Everyone knew it worked. The question was how far it could push a man before the man broke. Ranke began running trials in 1938 with groups of military volunteers, sleep deprivation experiments, endurance marches, cognitive tests administered after 36 and then 48, and then 72 hours without sleep. The control groups deteriorated on schedule, reaction time slowing, decision-making collapsing, men falling asleep mid-task with their eyes still partially open. The Pervitin groups kept going. Not indefinitely, but far past any threshold Ranke had observed with caffeine or other available stimulants. A soldier on Pervitin could function, at least by surface measurements, through conditions that would have rendered an untreated soldier combat ineffective within hours. Ranke wrote to the Wehrmacht High Command in the spring of 1939. The letter was precise and enthusiastic. He recommended Pervitin for military use across all branches, proposed a standard dosing schedule, and suggested that it be incorporated into operational planning, not as an emergency measure, but as a routine supply item, like rations. The High Command read the letter. They did not immediately act on it. They filed it. Then, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the letter stopped being theoretical. Ernst Langen arrived in the staging area outside Warsaw 3 weeks into the Polish campaign. The invasion was moving faster than anyone had publicly predicted. But inside the medical corps, the speed created its own particular problems. Units were advancing so rapidly that supply lines were perpetually strained. Food was irregular. Sleep was a luxury rationed by circumstance rather than schedule. Langen's job was to keep soldiers functional enough to fight, and the tools available to him for that purpose were limited. Morphine for the wounded, sulfur powder for infections, and the sealed container of Pervitin that had appeared in his supplies without ceremony or explanation. The written instructions told him each soldier could receive 1 pill before an extended operation. 2 was the maximum. The sheet said nothing about frequency, nothing about duration, nothing about what came after. He distributed the first batch on a Tuesday evening before a night advance. 23 men. He handed each one a pill and watched them swallow it. Within 40 minutes, something in the unit's atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly from a distance, but perceptibly to anyone standing close enough. The low muttering that preceded any night operation quieted. Men checked their equipment a second time without being told. A sergeant who'd been complaining about his feet for 3 days stopped mentioning them. They moved out at midnight and covered terrain that should have taken until dawn by 9 in the morning. Nobody slept during the march. Nobody asked to. Langen made a note in his medical log. He recorded the distribution, the dosage, and the observed outcome. The entry was 4 lines long. He used no language that could be called alarming. Across the German lines in Poland, the pattern repeated itself at a scale Langen couldn't see from his single forward station. Pervitin wasn't yet an official Wehrmacht supply item in September 1939. Ranke's recommendation was still working its way through channels, but it was available commercially, and soldiers had been buying it themselves since before the invasion. Some units had officers who actively encouraged its use. Others had men who simply carried their own tin from home, the same tin their wives or mothers used, because in Germany in 1939 there was no meaningful distinction between the thing a housewife took for morning fatigue and the thing a soldier swallowed before crossing into enemy territory. The molecule was identical, the tin was the same, the context was everything. What the Polish campaign demonstrated to the officers paying attention was not just that Pervitin worked, but that it worked at the operational level, meaning it didn't just affect individual soldiers, it affected unit behaviour. A platoon on Pervitin moved differently than a platoon without it. It made decisions faster. It sustained momentum through the hours when momentum naturally decayed. For a military doctrine built entirely around speed, strike fast, penetrate deep, don't allow the enemy time to respond, this was not a minor pharmaceutical detail. This was doctrine altering. By the time the Polish campaign ended in October 1939, Ranke had his data. He had casualty reports, field observations from medical officers including Langen, and his own ongoing laboratory results. He compiled everything into a second memo to the High Command. This one was longer, more specific, and harder to file away. He recommended immediate official incorporation of Pervitin into Wehrmacht supply chains, proposed standardized distribution protocols, and attached estimated quantities for an unspecified, major Western operation. The High Command approved. The order went to Temla. The factory in Tempelhof began scaling production. Nobody asked Temla's chemists whether the production timeline was safe. Nobody asked what happened to a man who took Pervitin every day for 6 months. The question on the table wasn't about long-term pharmacology. The question was about spring, and what Germany was planning to do in the spring. Langen spent the winter of 1939 to 1940 at a rear medical station, treating the ordinary injuries of an army at rest between campaigns. Frostbite, infections, the accumulated physical damage of a fast-moving war. He had some time to think. He reviewed his own notes from the Polish campaign and found himself returning to one entry. Not the first distribution, not the march, but an observation he'd made in the third week. A corporal named Wolf had come to him asking for additional Pervitin 3 days after the operation for which it had been issued. The operation was over. There was no advance scheduled. Wolf said he wasn't sleeping well and felt slow. Langen had given him nothing and told him the fatigue was normal after sustained operations. Wolf came back the next day, and the day after that. On the fourth visit, his hands had a faint tremor that wasn't there before, barely perceptible, the kind a person could easily attribute to cold or tiredness. Langen had noted it without acting on it. Within the week, Wolf's unit rotated forward, and Langen lost track of him. He thought about Wolf that winter. He thought about the instruction sheet that had no upper limit on frequency, only on daily dose. He thought about the word maximum and what exactly it was intended to maximize or protect against. He didn't write any of this in his medical log. He wasn't sure why. In Munich, Clara Brenner's morning ritual had calcified into something she no longer examined. Wake at 5, fill the kettle, open the tin. The pill went down with the first glass of water before the kettle was ready, because waiting felt unreasonable. By the time her children were dressed and eating, she was moving at the pace the day required. She attributed this to routine, to discipline, to being the kind of person who managed. Heinrich, her husband, had noticed the tin on the kitchen shelf but said nothing about it. His factory had started distributing Pervitin to workers on long shifts. A foreman handed them out the way supervisors elsewhere handed out cigarette breaks, as a practical measure for getting the work done. Heinrich took them at the factory and left Clara's tin alone. 2 tins in one household. Neither of them discussed. In February 1940, the German High Command finalised the details of Fall Gelb, the plan to invade France and the Low Countries. The Ardennes route, championed by General Erich von Manstein, required armoured columns to move through terrain considered impassable, and to do so with a speed that would prevent Allied forces from establishing a defensive line before the penetration was complete. The math of the operation depended on German units sustaining movement for periods that exceeded normal human endurance by a significant margin. The logistics planners building the supply schedules for Fall Gelb included Pervitin in the operational rations, not as an optional supplement, as a planned supply item, allocated per unit, per operation phase, per anticipated duration of continuous movement. 35 million tablets, 10 weeks. The number that opened this story wasn't a crisis, it was a plan. And somewhere inside that plan, in a column of figures on a Wehrmacht supply manifest, was the chemical arithmetic of what was about to happen to France, and to every German soldier who was going to be asked to make it happen. What none of those logistics planners wrote into their calculations, because it wasn't their job, and because no one had ordered them to consider it, was what the men running on those tablets would feel when the tablets ran out. That question was already answering itself in small ways in rear medical stations across occupied Poland. Langen had seen one of those small answers. He had chosen not to write it down. He would not have that choice much longer. The first thing Pervitin erased was the boundary between night and day, not metaphorically, physiologically. The human brain tracks time partly through the accumulation of a chemical called adenosine. It builds up during waking hours and creates the mounting pressure of fatigue, the heaviness behind the eyes that tells a body it needs to stop. Sleep clears it. Methamphetamine overrides it. Not by eliminating the adenosine, but by flooding the brain with enough dopamine and norepinephrine to drown the signal entirely. The fatigue is still there, accumulating in the background, building a debt the body cannot cancel. The person simply cannot feel it anymore. This is the precise mechanism by which a soldier could march for 72 hours and feel, on hour 70, not broken, but purposeful. The debt, however, was real. Every hour of chemical wakefulness was an hour of physiological damage being deferred, not avoided, deferred, into a future the body would eventually demand be paid in full. The brain doesn't forgive borrowed time, it collects. None of this was visible in May 1940. What was visible was France. Ernst Langen crossed into Belgium with a panzer unit on the 12th of May, 2 days into Fall Gelb. His medical station had been integrated directly into the armoured column. No longer a rear position, but a moving one. A truck with a red cross on the canvas top rolling through the Ardennes behind tanks that were advancing faster than the maps could keep pace with. He had distributed the first Pervitin allocation the night before the crossing. Every man in the unit had received 1 tablet. Most had taken it without ceremony, the way soldiers take anything handed to them by a medical officer, quickly, without questions, trusting the chain of command to have made reasonable decisions about what went into their bodies. Langen had taken one himself. He told himself it was for the same reason he had taken it during medical school. Practical necessity, a tool for a specific situation. The situation was specific enough. He hadn't slept in 31 hours. He was about to enter a combat zone, and the men he was responsible for keeping alive needed him functional. The reasoning held together the way most necessary decisions hold together, which is cleanly enough that a person doesn't examine the seams. The column moved through the Ardennes in a compression of time that Langen would later struggle to describe accurately in his notes. Not because the events were unclear, but because the drug made duration unreliable. Hours felt like either minutes or other hours. The darkness came and went without the usual biological punctuation of tiredness. He treated a burn wound somewhere around 2 a.m. and a shrapnel injury somewhere around dawn, and another burn an hour later, or possibly 3 hours later, and the men he treated were talking fast, working fast, moving with a precision that had an almost mechanical quality to it. Not frantic, not manic, but locked in, the way a person is locked in during the best hour of a very good day, extended impossibly across an entire night and into the next morning. By the time the unit reached the Meuse River, they had been moving for 58 hours. The men were still laughing at each other's jokes. What Pervitin produced, at its peak of operational effectiveness, was not euphoria in the way the word is commonly understood. It wasn't the florid distortion of reality associated with other substances. It was something more seductive and more dangerous, a sharpening. Colours didn't intensify. Sounds didn't distort. The world didn't become strange. It became more itself, more manageable, more legible. Problems that had felt overwhelming felt, on Pervitin, like problems that simply required the correct sequence of actions. Decisions arrived faster and with less uncertainty. Fear didn't disappear entirely, but it moved to the periphery, like a noise in another room that a person can register without being governed by it. This is why physicians had so little hesitation prescribing it. This is why soldiers accepted it without suspicion. This is why Clara Brenner, sitting in her Munich kitchen 14 months into her daily prescription, had no particular reason to question what she was taking. The pill made her functional. The alternative, the grey, dragging heaviness of the mornings before it, felt like the problem. The pill felt like the solution. From the inside, that logic was airtight. In Munich, the spring of 1940 arrived with a particular brightness that follows a hard winter. Clara had started taking 2 pills some mornings, not because her doctor had changed the prescription, but because one had stopped producing the same effect it once did. This was not an observation she framed as a problem. She framed it as a dosing adjustment, the way a person takes 2 aspirin instead of 1 when a headache is especially persistent. The tin was always running low 3 days before the end of the month. She had started supplementing it with a second tin bought directly from the pharmacy. No prescription required, because in 1940 no prescription was required. Heinrich was at the factory. The children were at school. The apartment was clean, and the letters were written, and the week's meals were planned before 9 in the morning. She had no reason to stop. Back inside the Panzer column threading through Belgium, a sergeant named Dieter Wolf, 31 years old, from a small town outside Cologne, a former railway worker who had been conscripted in 1938, took his second Pervitin of the operation on the morning of the third day. He was not supposed to take a second pill. The instruction sheet said 2 was the maximum. What the instruction sheet did not specify was whether that maximum applied per day, per operation, or per some other interval. And in the operational chaos of a moving armoured column in the middle of the fastest military advance in European history, no one was checking. Wolf was functioning. That was the observable measurement. He was loading, communicating, navigating. He had not slept in 60 hours, and he felt, this was the part that was difficult to explain later, he felt that sleep was something that happened to other people in a different kind of life, and that he was operating in a mode that didn't require it. Langen noticed Wolf on the morning of day 3, not because anything was wrong, but because something was slightly off in a way that resisted precise description. Wolf's movements were exact, too exact. He spoke in clipped, complete sentences where before he'd been looser, more conversational. His eyes moved across his environment in rapid, systematic sweeps, the way an animal's eyes move when it is orienting, not anxious, but scanning with an intensity that had no obvious target. Langen wrote nothing in his log. The column was moving. There was no time for entries that didn't involve wounds. Across the entire German advance, the same chemistry was playing out at a scale that made individual observation impossible. Thousands of men in hundreds of units were running on the same molecule, borrowed against the same biological debt, advancing into France with a speed that the Allied High Command had explicitly calculated was impossible given normal human limitations. The Allied calculations were correct. Under normal human limitations, the advance was impossible. The limitations had been chemically suspended. French and British commanders receiving reports of German troop positions in the second week of May 1940 kept adjusting their maps because the positions reported made no sense given how long the Germans had been moving. Units that should have been halted by fatigue were still advancing. Columns that should have required rest were bypassing rest points entirely. One British liaison officer, reviewing intelligence reports on the morning of May 14th, wrote in his field diary that the German movement suggested either a significant intelligence failure on the Allied side, or the possibility that the enemy's soldiers were operating under some form of artificial stimulus. He had no way of knowing how precisely correct that second hypothesis was. He also had no way of knowing what would happen to those soldiers when the stimulus ended. Nobody did, because the stimulus hadn't ended yet. Dieter Wolf was still scanning, still moving, still certain. And in the back of a truck rolling through the Ardennes, Ernst Langen was distributing the third day's allocation of Pervitin and trying to remember the last time he'd eaten a full meal, and finding to his faint surprise that he couldn't remember, and finding also, and this was the part that should have alarmed him more than it did, that he wasn't particularly hungry. France fell on the 22nd of June 1940. The armistice was signed in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918, a deliberate staging chosen for maximum symbolic weight. Hitler stood in that car for 3 minutes, and then left. The newsreels played the footage across Germany for weeks. The celebration was real. The victory was real. The speed of the conquest, 46 days from the opening of Fall Gelb to the French signature, was genuinely without precedent in modern warfare. And in the weeks immediately following, the German military's own field hospitals began filling with men who couldn't sleep. Not men who were choosing not to sleep. Men who had lost the mechanism. The first reports came from rear medical stations in northern France and Belgium, in late June and early July 1940, written by physicians who had no shared framework for what they were observing, because nothing in their training had prepared them for a cohort of otherwise physically intact soldiers presenting with this particular constellation of symptoms: severe insomnia lasting days after operations had ended, cardiac irregularities in men in their 20s with no prior history, paranoid ideation, a clinical term for the specific experience of being certain, with complete conviction, that people nearby intended harm. One report from a station outside Dunkirk described 3 soldiers in the same unit who had independently, without communication between them, become convinced that the medical staff treating them were enemy agents. Each of those 3 soldiers had consumed Pervitin continuously for between 8 and 12 days. The physicians writing these reports did not immediately connect the symptoms to the drug. They knew their patients had taken Pervitin. It was an official supply item. It was in the records. But the connection between the drug and the breakdown felt, to doctors trained in a framework that categorized Pervitin as a regulated medical supplement, like an extraordinary coincidence rather than a predictable pharmacological outcome. So they wrote combat stress on the files. Every single one of them wrote combat stress. Sergeant Dieter Wolf arrived at a rear medical station outside Lille on the 4th of July 1940, having not slept in what he estimated to be 5 days. The estimate was imprecise because his relationship to time had become unreliable in a way he found difficult to articulate. He knew the date intellectually, someone had told him, but the experience of the days themselves had lost their edges. They ran into each other like wet ink. The examining physician noted that Wolf's hands were steady, his speech coherent, his answers to basic orientation questions accurate. Physically, nothing was critically wrong. His heart rate was elevated, 98 beats per minute at rest, and his eyes had the fixed, slightly too wide quality of someone who had been frightened and hadn't yet processed it. But he wasn't presenting with any injury, any fever, any visible wound. The physician asked Wolf how much Pervitin he had taken over the preceding 2 weeks. Wolf's answer required the physician to ask him to repeat it. The amount Wolf described, reconstructed across multiple days of operational distribution plus supplemental doses he had obtained by trading cigarettes with another soldier, worked out to approximately 14 tablets over 12 days. The recommended maximum for an operation of that length under Ranke's official protocol was 6. The physician wrote combat exhaustion, possible stimulant overuse in the file. Then he crossed out possible. Then he paused and crossed out stimulant overuse entirely and wrote combat exhaustion. He didn't record his own reasoning for the correction. He may not have had clear reasoning. He may have simply understood, in the practical way of a military physician in a victorious army in 1940, that the file would be read by people above him. Wolf was sent to rest for 4 days and returned to his unit. Ernst Langen was by this point stationed at a medical post in occupied France, treating the ordinary injuries of an army settling into its conquest. He had time to review his notes from the campaign and found himself counting, across his own distribution records, how many men had received Pervitin beyond the standard allocation. The number was higher than he expected. He had distributed additional doses on his own authority during the push through Belgium, making judgment calls in the field based on the operational necessity of keeping soldiers functional. He had done this 12 times in 11 days. He had also, he now calculated, taken 18 tablets himself over that period. The recommended maximum for a 12-day operation was 8. He sat with this number for a while. Then he went back to treating injuries. The withdrawal from his own overconsumption had arrived not as a collapse, but as a grey, persistent flatness, the world continuing at its normal pace while something inside him ran at 3/4 speed. He slept 9 hours a night and woke feeling as though he hadn't slept at all. Food had no particular taste. Letters from his family in Stuttgart arrived, and he read them carefully and felt less than he expected to feel. He attributed this to the accumulated stress of the campaign. The explanation was available and he took it. In Berlin, Otto Ranke was receiving the field reports. Not all of them. Information moved through military bureaucracy in filtered streams, and by the time observations from forward medical stations reached the Institute for General and Defense Physiology, they had passed through several layers of summarization. But enough of the pattern was visible in the data he received that Ranke, who was a careful scientist, began updating his calculations. His internal notes from July and August 1940, recovered and studied by historians after the war, show a man working through a problem he hadn't fully anticipated. The efficacy data was exactly as predicted. The breakdown data was not. The rate of psychiatric presentations in soldiers with documented heavy Pervitin use was running at roughly 3 times what Ranke had modelled as the worst-case scenario in his pre-war laboratory trials. He wrote a memo. Not to the High Command, to his own files. Private, not circulated. In it he noted that the dependency potential of Pervitin at operational dosing levels appeared to be substantially higher than the civilian medical literature suggested, and that the psychiatric risks of multi-day continuous use were significant enough to warrant revised dosing guidelines and mandatory rest protocols following operations. He did not send this memo to the High Command. He did not send it anywhere. The victory over France was the single greatest military triumph in German history. The Wehrmacht was being celebrated in every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every public square from Berlin to Vienna. Ranke's memo, circulated in that environment, would have landed not as a scientific correction but as a criticism of the campaign's methods that had just produced a result that silenced every prior skeptic. He filed the memo. He kept working. And here is the thing that should stop the breath for a moment. The data existed. The connection between Pervitin and psychiatric breakdown was documented in the military's own files before the autumn of 1940. It was not hidden by a corporation, not buried by a government minister, not lost in a bombing raid. It was written down by the scientist most qualified to interpret it, and then placed in a drawer by that same scientist, and the drawer was closed. The second winter of the war arrived. Germany began planning its next campaign, not west, but east. The distances involved were incomprehensible compared to France. The Soviet Union's western frontier to Moscow was roughly 10 times the distance from the German border to Paris. The logistics planners began drawing up new supply schedules. Pervitin appeared in the column for rations. Nobody had revised the dosing guidelines. Nobody had sent Ranke's memo. And in Munich, Clara Brenner opened her second tin of the month on the 15th of October, 4 days ahead of schedule, and noted with mild irritation that she would need to visit the pharmacy again before the weekend, and wrote it on her shopping list between bread and lamp oil, and did not think about it again. Dieter Wolf was back with his units somewhere in northern France, preparing for redeployment. The tremor in his hands had never fully resolved. It was slight enough that only he could feel it, not in both hands equally, but in the right, when he was sitting still and not concentrating on something. When he moved, when he was active, it disappeared. So he stayed active. He had not told anyone about the tremor. He was not sure what there was to tell. The question of what was in Ranke's memo, and what would have changed if it had been sent, was about to become much larger than one scientist's private calculation. Because east of Germany's borders, something was being planned at a scale that would make the French campaign look like a rehearsal, and the chemical logic that had sustained it through 46 days would now be asked to sustain something across years. What happens to a man, or an army, running on borrowed time when the lender finally comes to collect? Operation Barbarossa began on the 22nd of June, 1941, exactly 1 year to the day after France signed its armistice. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory along a front that stretched nearly 2,900 kilometers from the Arctic coast to the Black Sea. It was the largest military invasion in human history, and it was built on the assumption that it would be over before winter. It was not over before winter. What happened instead was that the operational logic of Pervitin, effective for days, perhaps weeks, in a fast-moving campaign with a defined endpoint, was now being applied to a conflict that had no visible endpoint, across distances that swallowed the concept of momentum whole, against an enemy that didn't collapse the way France had collapsed. The pills kept coming, the front kept expanding, the debt kept accumulating. Ernst Langen arrived on the Eastern Front in August 1941, attached to an infantry division pushing toward Kiev. The landscape was the first difference, not the tactical situation, not the enemy, but the sheer physical scale of the terrain. In France, there had always been a horizon with something on it. Here, the horizon was just more of the same, flat, enormous, indifferent. Roads that existed on maps didn't always exist on the ground. Supply trucks fell behind the advance by days, then by weeks. When they arrived, they brought food, ammunition, and Pervitin, always Pervitin, in that approximate order of priority. Langen's allocation for August was 400 tablets for a unit of 180 men. He did the arithmetic and found it disturbing. The allocation assumed an operational tempo that would require most of those men to be taking Pervitin continuously for the entire month. He distributed it anyway. There was no mechanism for declining an official supply allocation. By the autumn of 1941, something had shifted inside the German field medical system that had no precise start date and no formal acknowledgement. The shift was this. Soldiers were no longer taking Pervitin exclusively before operations. They were taking it to function. The distinction sounds minor. It wasn't. In France, Pervitin had been used instrumentally for a specific push, a specific number of hours, a specific objective. On the Eastern Front, the push never ended. There was no clean boundary between operation and non-operation, between the moment requiring chemical augmentation and the moment allowing recovery. The front was continuous. The cold arrived in October and stripped the last possibility of comfortable rest. Men slept in dugouts in frozen ground for 3 or 4 hours and woke already depleted, and the pill was there, and the alternative to taking it was feeling what the body actually felt, which was a depth of exhaustion that had no clean bottom. Langen watched his unit's consumption double between August and November. He tracked it in his private notes because the official logs required him to record distribution, not motivation, and recording only distribution let him maintain a version of the numbers that looked like planned operational use rather than what it increasingly resembled. He knew what it resembled. He had studied pharmacology. In November 1941, a private named Gerhard Steiner, 19 years old from a farm outside Nuremberg in Langen's unit since September, took 4 Pervitin tablets in a single day during a sustained engagement near Kharkov. The prescribed maximum was 2 per day. Steiner was not acting irrationally in the context he occupied. The engagement lasted 14 hours, his unit was taking casualties, and the alternative to staying chemically alert was a cognitive state that could get him and the men around him killed. He stayed alert. The engagement ended. That night, sitting in a dugout with a tin cup of something that passed for coffee, Steiner told the man next to him that the shadows outside the entrance to the dugout were moving in a pattern that indicated deliberate surveillance. He said this quietly, precisely, with the tone of someone reporting a tactical observation. The man next to him looked at the shadows, They were tree branches moving in wind. He didn't report this to Langen immediately. In a combat unit, one man's strange observation is ordinary noise. The next morning Steiner was at the entrance to Langen's medical tent before dawn, standing exactly centered in the opening, not moving. When Langen asked him what he needed, Steiner said he needed to report that 3 men in the unit were passing information to Soviet forces through a system of signals embedded in their daily activity patterns. He named the 3 men. He had known them since basic training. Langen wrote, "acute paranoid episode, possible stimulant psychosis," in his private notes. In Steiner's official file, he wrote, "combat stress reaction, temporary." He sent Steiner to the rear. He never saw him again. Steiner was not an isolated case. He was a data point in a pattern that Langen was now actively, systematically tracking. Because the physician who had declined to write things down in France had become, on the Eastern Front, a man quietly building a file, not an official report. A private document written in a small notebook he kept inside his medical kit, beneath the bandage rolls where it wouldn't be casually found. He recorded names, dates, dosages where he could reconstruct them, and symptom presentations. Psychosis, cardiac events, violent episodes with no tactical trigger. One case of a soldier who had simply walked away from his unit during a rest period and been found 3 kilometers away, standing in an open field, unable to explain how he had gotten there. By December 1941, Langen's private notebook contained 41 entries, 41 men, 1 medical officer, 1 front. He was one of hundreds of medical officers on the Eastern Front. The number he was tracking was a fraction of what existed in the system, and then came the second revelation, the one that reframed the supply problem entirely. In early 1942, a Wehrmacht logistics officer named Heinrich Voss was conducting a routine audit of medical supply consumption across 3 divisions on the Central Front. His job was administrative, matching requisition records against distribution records, identifying discrepancies, flagging irregularities for review. He was not a physician. He had no particular interest in pharmacology. He was an accountant in a uniform doing accountant's work. What he found was a gap. Across the 3 divisions he audited, the Pervitin requisition records, the amounts units had formally requested from supply, matched the official distribution figures precisely. The numbers aligned. This was normal. What was not normal was that Voss, cross-referencing against a separate set of transport manifests he had obtained for an unrelated logistical inquiry, found that the actual quantity shipped to those divisions was substantially higher than either set of records showed. The difference across 3 divisions over 6 months was approximately 40,000 tablets. 40,000 tablets that had been shipped, received, and consumed, but recorded nowhere. Voss filed his findings with his commanding officer. His commanding officer reviewed the discrepancy, made a note, and informed Voss that the matter would be investigated through medical supply channels. No investigation through medical supply channels was ever opened. Voss's audit report was filed and retained, which is how historians found it after the war, intact, unredacted, with the 40,000 tablet gap sitting in plain arithmetic on page 7. The real consumption was roughly double the official figures, possibly more. The official figures were already alarming enough that no one at the institutional level wanted to examine what the real figures implied about dependency rates across the entire Eastern Front force, so no one examined it. In Munich, the winter of 1941 to 1942 arrived with shortages that touched everything, including pharmaceuticals. Clara Brenner went to her pharmacy in November and found that the Pervitin supply was reduced. The military's consumption priority had begun drawing against the same production the civilian market depended on. She received half her usual amount. The pharmacist told her it would likely be the same the following month. She sat with this information on the tram home, half the usual amount. She calculated what that meant against her daily consumption, which had been 2 tablets a day for the past year, double the original prescription, and found that the reduced supply would last her approximately 8 days in a 30-day month. She had never gone 8 consecutive days without Pervitin since 1938. She didn't know what that would feel like. She found that not knowing frightened her more than the shortage itself. It was the kind of fear that doesn't have an obvious object, not fear of a specific thing happening, but fear of what she might discover about herself if the thing she relied on to function was taken away. She rationed carefully that month. She felt the rationing in everything. Heinrich Brenner returned from the Eastern Front in March 1942 on medical leave. He'd been on the front since the previous June. Clara met him at the Munich train station on a Wednesday morning, the children beside her, and knew something was wrong before he reached the bottom of the platform steps. Not wrong in the way of visible injury, wrong in the way of something interior having changed its shape. He was thin in the specific way of someone who'd been unable to eat rather than someone who'd simply been underfed. His face having the drawn, slightly carved quality that comes from sustained stimulant suppression of appetite over months. His hands were still, conspicuously still, in the controlled way of someone who has learned to hold them quiet. He embraced his children and held them for a long time, and said very little on the walk to the tram. That night, Clara found his coat hanging by the door, and in the pocket, out of old habit, she found a tin. It was empty. The edges were worn smooth, handled so often the paint had come off the corners. She put it back. She didn't ask him about it. He didn't ask about hers. 2 people in one apartment, the same molecule running through both their histories, and between them the ordinary silence of a marriage that had survived something neither of them had language for yet. Heinrich could not sleep without pills. He could not function on them anymore either. The doses that had once produced alertness now produced only a kind of jittery, purposeless agitation, a motor without a gear, spinning without traction. He was caught in the space between dependent and tolerant, the worst position the drug produced, needing it to reach baseline, but baseline itself having shifted so far that the drug couldn't reach it anymore. Langen's notebook, growing thicker in a dugout on the Eastern Front, contained a clinical description of exactly this state. He had written it in December 1941, watching it happen to other men. He had not yet recognized it in himself, but his own tin was running low, and the question he'd been avoiding since France, the one about what the instruction sheet meant by maximum, and who had decided that number and what they had based it on, was becoming harder to defer. Because the man who had decided that number, Otto Ranker, had written a memo in the summer of 1940 that nobody had read. And somewhere above all of this, above Langen's dugout, above Clara's kitchen, above the falsified supply records and the filed memo and the 41 names in a private notebook, a physician in Berlin was preparing his bag for a house call. His patient had been complaining of fog, of indecision, of a heaviness that descended in the afternoons and made the evenings difficult. The physician's name was Theodor Morell. His bag contained several items. He was not going to explain all of them. Theodor Morell had not been a distinguished physician before 1936. He ran a private practice on the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin, treating wealthy patients for skin conditions and venereal diseases. Respectable work, but not the kind that builds a reputation extending beyond one's waiting room. He was heavy, poorly groomed by the standards of his social circle, and described by colleagues with a specific diplomatic vagueness reserved for someone technically competent, but not especially admired. His patients liked him. He listened carefully, prescribed aggressively, and produced results that more cautious physicians sometimes couldn't. That last quality was what brought him to Hitler. A mutual acquaintance arranged an introduction in 1936 after Hitler had been suffering for months from debilitating stomach cramps that his previous physicians hadn't resolved. Morell examined him, prescribed a course of treatment involving intestinal bacteria cultures, unusual at the time, dismissed by other doctors as fringe medicine, and within weeks Hitler reported feeling dramatically better. That was enough. Morell became Hitler's personal physician, and from that moment his career trajectory separated entirely from the ordinary arc of a Berlin doctor's life. By 1941, he had an office inside Hitler's headquarters. He attended every major military conference. His access was absolute, and his bag had grown considerably more complex than intestinal bacteria. The document that changed everything was found by American intelligence officers in May 1945 in a farmhouse in Bavaria where Morell had fled as Allied forces closed in. He had burned what he could. He hadn't burned enough. Among the surviving papers were his personal medical diaries, detailed, clinical, written in the compressed shorthand of a physician who kept records for his own reference rather than for any external audience. Those diaries covered 9 years of treating Adolf Hitler. What they revealed required historians and pharmacologists decades to fully interpret, because the picture they presented was not simple. Morell had not been administering one thing. He had been administering a rotating, escalating, layered cocktail of substances that by the final years of the war had grown to include upward of 80 distinct compounds. Vitamins, hormones, glucose, barbiturates, opioids, and, documented specifically and repeatedly from 1943 onward, methamphetamine. Not Pervitin by name. Morell used a preparation called vitamultin, manufactured by a pharmaceutical company Morell himself had a financial stake in, which contained methamphetamine as its active stimulant component. The branding was different. The molecule was identical to what Langen was distributing in dugouts on the Eastern Front. Hitler didn't know this. He knew the injections worked. He knew that after Morell's needle the fog lifted and the certainty returned, and the afternoon became manageable again. He trusted Morell with a completeness that he extended to almost no one else in his inner circle. Other physicians who examined Hitler and raised concerns about Morell's methods were dismissed, sometimes within days of raising them. Hitler's personal secretary noted in her own diary that any criticism of Morell produced in Hitler a reaction disproportionate to the criticism, not defensive, but coldly final. The way a person reacts when the thing being criticized is not a preference, but a dependency. He was protecting his supply. He didn't have the framework to understand that's what he was doing. Here is where the story pivots on its axis. Morell's diaries don't just record what Hitler was given, they record the timing, date, hour, compound administered, observed effect. And when those records are laid against the chronology of Hitler's major military decisions, mapped by historians who spent years cross-referencing the diary entries against conference transcripts, field orders, and the testimonies of officers present at headquarters, a pattern emerges that is not subtle. In the hours following a Morell injection, Hitler was expansive. His thinking accelerated. He spoke in long, connected chains of strategic reasoning, moved between topics with facility, engaged with technical details he normally delegated. Officers who attended morning briefings after his injection described a man who seemed to have arrived at conclusions before the briefing began, already certain, already committed, wanting confirmation rather than counsel. In the hours before an injection, or during the gaps when Morell was unavailable, the picture was different. Hitler became slow, irritable in the specific, low-grade way of someone whose body is signalling a need it can't name. His concentration frayed at the edges. He cancelled briefings. He retired to his private quarters and gave instructions not to be disturbed. Decisions that required his approval sat unsigned for hours or, in several documented cases, for days. The rhythm was pharmacological. His staff had simply learned to work around it without understanding its source. But now the deeper twist, the one that reframes not just Hitler's behaviour, but the behaviour of everyone around him. Among the surviving post-war testimonies of senior Wehrmacht officers, several accounts describe a practice so matter-of-fact that its implications were overlooked for years. Multiple officers independently described the same operational habit. When a decision of critical importance needed to be brought to Hitler, experienced staff members would wait. Not randomly, strategically. They would time the presentation of major decisions for the window approximately 90 minutes after Morel had been in with the Führer, the injection window, the window of certainty and expansiveness and receptiveness. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's aide noted in a 1946 deposition that senior officers had an informal understanding about the productive hours, the periods when Hitler could be engaged, as opposed to the periods when engagement was futile or actively counterproductive. Nobody at the time articulated why those hours existed. They simply mapped them and adapted. What this means, followed to its logical end, is extraordinary. Some of the most consequential military decisions of the Second World War, resource allocations, offensive authorizations, strategic commitments, were being timed not around tactical necessity or intelligence windows, but around one man's injection schedule. The most powerful military apparatus in the world was, at its apex, being navigated around the pharmacological cycles of its leader. Nobody in that inner circle called it that. They called it catching him at the right moment. The withdrawal states deserve specific attention because they are where the damage concentrated. When methamphetamine's effect wanes, the brain confronts the gap between its chemically inflated dopamine levels and its actual baseline, and the gap is enormous. The withdrawal isn't gentle. It produces irritability that sits just below the threshold of reason, a state in which everything feels like an affront, in which the mind looks for causes for its own biochemical discomfort and finds them in whatever is present. It also produces a specific cognitive pattern that clinicians now recognize clearly: rigidity. The flexible, multi-option thinking of the elevated state collapses into tunnel vision. The person becomes not just irritable, but certain. Certain in the narrow, defended way of someone whose brain is protecting itself from the cognitive cost of doubt. Several of Hitler's most operationally catastrophic decisions cluster in documented withdrawal windows. The insistence in December 1941 that German forces hold their positions against the Soviet winter counteroffensive, rather than conducting tactical withdrawals, a decision that cost tens of thousands of lives and which every senior field commander present argued against, was issued during a period when Morel's diary shows a 4-day gap in injections due to a supply interruption. The refusal in the summer of 1942 to redirect forces from the Caucasus oil campaign to reinforce Stalingrad, a decision that sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, was made during what Morel's records describe as a period of patient irritability and resistance to consultation. This is not a claim that methamphetamine caused these decisions. The ideology, the ego, the structural pathologies of the Nazi command system, those were always there. The drug didn't create the rigidity. It amplified it in the moments when amplification had the largest possible consequences. Ernst Langen, in his dugout on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942, knew none of this. What he knew was narrower and more immediate. His private notebook now held 63 entries. His own tin of Pervitin, which he'd been refilling from his official medical allocation on the logic that a physician who couldn't function served no one, was being consumed at a rate that had quietly crossed from supplemental to structural. He noticed this not dramatically but procedurally, the way a careful person notices a leak, by the evidence it leaves rather than the moment it begins. He had started his day with a pill for 11 consecutive weeks. The report he'd begun drafting in November, a systematic account of dependency presentations across his unit, intended for the medical corps headquarters, sat 14 pages long in the same notebook as his case records. 14 pages of clinical observation, carefully written, medically precise, documenting a pattern that the official system was recording as combat stress and filing without action. He read it through one evening in January 1943 by the light of a field lantern. It was good work, clear, documented, impossible to easily dismiss. He thought about Ranke's trials from 1938, the enthusiasm of that initial memo to the High Command. He thought about the supply officer whose audit had presumably gone nowhere. He thought about Steiner walking across an open field in the snow, unable to explain how he had arrived there. Then he thought about what would happen to a medical officer on the Eastern Front who submitted an unsolicited report documenting systematic drug dependency in a Wehrmacht combat unit, a report that implicitly criticized the official supply policy, the distribution protocols, and by extension the operational planning of the campaigns those policies had supported. He closed the notebook. He put it back under the bandage rolls. He didn't ask himself whether he would open it again. That question had an answer he wasn't ready to examine. Outside the dugout, the temperature was minus 22 degrees. In the distance, artillery. The sound so constant by now that it had stopped registering as a sound and become simply the texture of the air. He took his morning pill, and in Berlin, in a warm office that smelled of antiseptic and expensive cologne, Theodor Morell was preparing the next injection, a slightly higher dose than the previous week's, because the previous week's dose had stopped producing the same effect, and the patient had noticed, and the patient had communicated his dissatisfaction with the particular clarity that only the most powerful man in Europe could bring to the subject of his own medical care. Morell adjusted the dose. He always adjusted the dose. That was why his patient trusted him. The needle went in, the fog lifted, the certainty returned. And somewhere in the Reich Chancellery an aide was calculating the timing. How long before the briefing could begin? How long before the window opened? How long before the Führer was ready to hear what needed to be decided? By the spring of 1944, the war had turned in ways that no quantity of methamphetamine could reverse. The Eastern Front had collapsed inward by hundreds of kilometres. The Allied landings in Italy had put enemy forces on European soil. Inside Wehrmacht headquarters, the maps told a story that the official communiqué did not, and the men who read those maps every morning had developed a particular quality of silence. The silence of people who understand exactly what they are looking at, and have no framework for saying it aloud. Hitler's physical deterioration had become impossible to manage discreetly. His left hand trembled continuously by early 1944, not the faint, controllable tremor that Dieter Wolf had learned to suppress through constant movement, but a visible, persistent shake that required Hitler to hold his left arm pressed against his body during public appearances to prevent it from being photographed. His posture had compressed, the spine curving forward as if the weight of the previous 5 years had settled physically into his vertebrae. His skin carried the grey, slightly translucent quality of someone whose body was performing maintenance functions on severely depleted reserves. Morell was seeing him twice daily now, sometimes 3 times. The doses had climbed steadily since 1942. The climb was documented in Morell's diary with the neutral precision of a man recording barometric pressure, date, compound, quantity, observed response. What the diary captured without apparent awareness was a tolerance curve of textbook regularity. Each adjustment brought weeks before the next adjustment became necessary. The gap between injections that produced effect and injections that merely prevented deterioration had narrowed to almost nothing. Hitler's body had stopped responding to the drug as a stimulus. It now required the drug to approximate normal function. On the 20th of July, 1944, a briefcase containing a bomb was placed under a conference table at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters in East Prussia. The officer who placed it, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, had constructed the device to kill everyone in the room. At the moment of detonation, 4 men died. Hitler survived with a perforated eardrum, burns on both legs, and a temporary paralysis in his right arm. The circumstance of his survival became one of the most analysed accidents of the war. The bomb had been moved. Specifically, another officer at the table, finding the briefcase inconveniently positioned near his feet during the briefing, had pushed it further under the table, behind a thick oak support column. That column absorbed a significant portion of the blast that would otherwise have been directed toward Hitler's position. This much is established historical fact. What medical historians added decades later, working from Morell's diary in conjunction with eyewitness accounts of Hitler's behaviour in the hours before the briefing, was something the historians present at the event had no way of recognising. Morell's diary entry for July 20th, 1944, records an injection administered at 7:40 in the morning, a standard daily dose. It also records a second injection at 11:15, approximately 90 minutes before the briefing began, described as supplemental due to patients' reported fatigue and difficulty concentrating. The compound used for the second injection included the methamphetamine preparation. Multiple eyewitnesses who attended the briefing described Hitler as unusually restless in the opening minutes, unable to remain still, shifting his position at the table repeatedly, moving around the table's edge to examine the map from a different angle. It was during one of these position shifts, captured in the account of an aide standing near the door, that Hitler moved away from his original position at the table. 30 seconds later, the bomb detonated at his original position. Whether the stimulant-induced restlessness and the position shift were causally connected is a question that cannot be definitively answered. What can be said is that Morell recorded the timing, the eyewitnesses recorded the behaviour, and the behaviour was consistent with the hyperactive state the compound reliably produced in the 90 minutes following administration. The oak column did the rest. He survived, partly by architecture, possibly by chemistry. The footage filmed that evening, Hitler appearing before cameras to demonstrate his survival, was broadcast across Germany within hours. In it, his right arm hangs without movement at his side, held deliberately still. His voice is intact. He speaks with the compressed, rigid certainty of a man who has been through something enormous and is performing the fact of his own continuity. Morell administered a third injection before the filming. In Leipzig, in a military hospital ward on the 3rd floor where the windows faced an interior courtyard, Heinrich Brenner died on the 14th of January 1945. He was 34 years old. The cause recorded in his file was cardiac failure. The file did not record what his heart had been running on for the preceding 4 years, or what happens to a cardiac muscle subjected to sustained methamphetamine exposure across thousands of individual doses administered under combat stress in temperatures that regularly reached -30 degrees. Clara received the notification by post. She read it standing at the kitchen counter because the postman had arrived while she was preparing lunch, and she had opened it without particular premonition, the way a person opens official correspondence. She stood with the letter for a while. Then she folded it, placed it in the drawer where she kept important documents, and finished preparing lunch for the children. That afternoon she took 2 Pervitin. She'd been taking 2 every morning for 3 years. She did not take an additional dose. This is recorded in the precise self-accounting she had unconsciously maintained, the way people who are managing something carefully maintain internal arithmetic. She simply took her ordinary amount and moved through the rest of the day with the mechanical efficiency the drug provided, She was 35 years old. She'd been taking methamphetamine every day for 7 years. On the Eastern Front in early February 1945, Ernst Langen's position was overrun by Soviet forces during a rapid advance that gave his unit less than 4 hours of warning. He had enough time to destroy his official medical records per standing orders, which he did. He did not destroy his private notebook. He put it in his coat pocket. In the chaos of the retreat, he was separated from his unit and captured by a Soviet patrol 3 kilometers behind his own lines. His medical kit was confiscated at the collection point. With it went his Pervitin supply, 11 tablets remaining from the month's allocation, which he had been taking 1 per day, every day, without exception, for 19 consecutive months. The notebook stayed in his coat. Nobody searched the coat. In the Soviet prisoner collection facility, surrounded by several hundred other captured German soldiers, Langen experienced the first full day without Pervitin he had managed since the autumn of 1943. The experience announced itself not with dramatic symptoms but with weight, a heaviness that settled into his limbs with a specific, dense quality of something that had always been there and had simply been blocked from perception until now. He slept 14 hours and woke feeling worse than before he had slept. Day 2 was harder. Day 3 was the worst. He noted the progression in his private notebook, still clinical, still precise, but with a sentence at the bottom of the entry for day 3 that broke the clinical register entirely. He wrote that he now understood, from the inside, every case he had recorded in the preceding 63 entries. He wrote that the understanding had arrived too late to be useful. Then he closed the notebook and didn't open it again for 2 months. Across Germany in the final weeks of the war, the pharmaceutical infrastructure that had sustained the military's Pervitin supply was collapsing under Allied bombing. The Temmler factory in Tempelhof had been damaged in late 1944. Secondary production facilities were losing power intermittently. Shipments to frontline units became sporadic in January 1945 and stopped almost entirely by March. What this meant, at scale, was an entire army going into simultaneous withdrawal. Men who had been taking Pervitin continuously for months or years, not because they were weak, not because they had been irresponsible, but because the supply chain had made it structurally inescapable, were now fighting the final battles of the war in a state of profound pharmacological collapse. The Wehrmacht's last defensive operations in the East and West were conducted by soldiers whose bodies were reclaiming every borrowed hour of the preceding 4 years simultaneously. The cognitive impairment of acute methamphetamine withdrawal includes slowed processing, impaired judgment, emotional dysregulation, and a physical fatigue so deep it can be indistinguishable from illness. The men defending Germany in March and April 1945 were, by any clinical measure, not the same men who had crossed the Ardennes in May 1940. The drug that had accelerated them into the war was leaving them in its own time, on its own schedule, with complete indifference to the battles still requiring their participation. In the Führerbunker beneath Berlin, Theodor Morell continued his work for as long as he could. His diary entries in March and April 1945 have a compressed, increasingly abbreviated quality, as if the writer was aware that the audience for these records was narrowing. He documents doses, he documents responses, he documents, on the 14th of April, that his patient's tremor had extended to the right hand, that his gait had deteriorated to a shuffle, that his effect between injections had become so flat that Morell had begun administering doses more frequently simply to produce observable responsiveness. Hitler dismissed Morell on the 21st of April 1945, 9 days before his own death. The dismissal was abrupt. No explanation was recorded. Morell fled Berlin by plane the following day, leaving his diaries behind, He may not have understood what he was leaving. He may have understood exactly. Either way, the diaries survived. The farmhouse in Bavaria where American officers found them was intact, the papers stacked in a leather case that had been pushed under a bed, not hidden with care but set aside with the urgency of a man who had run out of time and had to choose what to carry. What he chose not to carry was the record of 9 years. What the record contained was the answer to a question that nobody, in all the years of the war, had asked clearly enough to receive a clear answer. What exactly had been running through the veins of the man making the decisions? Now the answer existed, written in a physician's hand, dated, dosed and documented, and the war was over. And the question of what to do with that answer had just become enormously complicated. The American intelligence officers who processed Morell's diaries in the summer of 1945 were not pharmacologists. They were analysts, trained to extract operationally useful information from captured documents, troop movements, command structures, weapon specifications. A physician's private medical records fell outside their primary frame of reference. They catalogued the diaries, translated the relevant sections, and forwarded summaries to the Military Medical Division for review. The Medical Division reviewed them, classified them, filed them. The full contents of Morell's diaries would not be made available to independent researchers until the 1980s. By then, the men who had been in the rooms where the decisions were made were mostly dead. The diaries sat in an archive in Washington for 4 decades, in a box with a reference number, generating no particular urgency. Nobody suppressed them deliberately. They were simply not treated as important. That absence of urgency is its own kind of answer about what the Allied powers chose to prioritize in the immediate post-war period, and what they chose not to examine too carefully. The Temla Pharmaceutical Company did not close in 1945. This requires a moment to sit with. The company that had manufactured 35 million Pervitin tablets for the Wehrmacht in 1940, that had scaled its production to supply an army's dependency across 5 years of continental war, that had operated with full knowledge of its product's military application, that company resumed civilian operations after the war ended. It operated in West Germany under various restructured arrangements. It produced pharmaceuticals. It remained in business, under different names and through different corporate reorganizations, until 1994. No Temla executive was prosecuted for the company's wartime role. No legal proceeding ever examined the supply contracts, the production records, or the clinical data Temla had accumulated during the war regarding dependency rates in military populations. That data, if it existed separately from military records, was never located by post-war investigators, either because it had been destroyed or because no investigator was specifically tasked with finding it, or both. In West Germany, methamphetamine was not classified as a controlled substance until 1967. For 22 years after the war, the same compound that had been distributed to soldiers as a combat ration remained available through medical channels with relatively limited restriction. German physicians continued prescribing it through the 1950s for the same indications that had driven its civilian adoption in the 1930s: fatigue, depression, weight management. The patients receiving those prescriptions were, in many cases, the same generation that had used Pervitin during the war, returning to a familiar molecule through a legitimate medical route. The continuity was structural. Nobody designed it that way. Nobody had to. Ernst Langen was released from Soviet captivity in the spring of 1950. He had been held for 5 years in a series of facilities across the Western Soviet Union, eventually settling into a camp in Ukraine where the primary work was agricultural labour. The conditions were not designed for survival, but they were survivable, and Langen was a physician who understood his own body well enough to manage it through circumstances that killed men who didn't have that knowledge. He arrived in West Germany at a transit processing centre outside Frankfurt on a Tuesday in April, carrying a canvas bag containing a change of clothes, his personal documents, and a notebook with a broken spine and water-damaged pages that had been in his coat pocket since February 1945. He registered with the West German Medical Authority. His credentials were reviewed. He was cleared to practice. He never practiced. He moved to a small town called Kirchzarten, near Freiburg in the Black Forest, a place he had no prior connection to, chosen apparently because it appeared in a railway schedule and had a post office and a bakery and no particular association with anything in his previous life. He rented 2 rooms above a hardware store. He took long walks in the forest in the mornings. The withdrawal from Pervitin had resolved in the Soviet camp within roughly 3 months. Not cleanly, not without a sustained flatness of mood and energy that had lingered for a year after the acute phase, but resolved in the sense that his baseline had eventually re-established itself without chemical support. He knew this not because a doctor had told him, but because he had tracked it himself in the same damaged notebook, adding entries again from month 4 of captivity onward, watching his own recovery with the same clinical notation he had applied to the 63 men he had observed before he became one of them. He did not submit the notebook to any medical authority. He did not publish its contents. He did not correspond with Ranke's Institute or with any pharmaceutical regulatory body about what the notebook contained. He stored it in a tin box under the floorboards of his rented room. The reason he gave, in a single sentence written on the notebook's inside cover sometime in the mid-1950s, the only personal statement in the entire document, was that he did not believe the people who needed to read it were ready to act on what it said. He may have been right. He may have been protecting himself. The sentence doesn't clarify which. In Munich, Clara Brenner's supply of Pervitin collapsed not through regulation but through attrition. Her original prescribing physician had died in 1948. The physician who replaced him at the practice was younger, trained in the immediate post-war period, unfamiliar with her history and working from her file, which listed her as a patient with a long-term prescription for a fatigue preparation without specifying what the preparation contained or how long she had been taking it. In October 1952, this new physician, reviewing her file as part of a routine administrative update, saw the prescription, noted that the compound was methamphetamine-based, and declined to renew it on the grounds that newer clinical guidance recommended against long-term use. He offered her a referral to a specialist. She didn't take the referral. What followed was 4 months that Clara would later describe to her daughter, once, in a single conversation that her daughter would remember for the rest of her life, as learning to feel time again. The days without Pervitin were long in a way that had a physical texture, not painful exactly, but heavy, granular, each hour present and unavoidable in a way that medicated hours had never been. She slept 12 hours and woke groggy. She sat at the kitchen table on certain mornings and couldn't construct a reason to stand up that felt adequate to the effort standing up required. The children were 11 and 13 by then. They were old enough to notice something was different about their mother. They were not old enough to understand what they were noticing. She recovered. Not on a schedule, not through treatment, not with medical support, simply through duration, the body gradually reclaiming a baseline that it had not operated from in 14 years. By the spring of 1953, she was sleeping 7 hours and waking without the weight. By summer, she had stopped measuring herself against what the drug had made her capable of. She never took it again. Not because she made a dramatic decision, because the prescription had expired and she chose quietly not to pursue another one. Otto Ranke, whose filed memo from 1940 had documented the psychiatric risks of military Pervitin use and then sat undistributed in a drawer while the Eastern Front consumed millions of doses, died in 1959. He had spent the post-war years working in academic medicine, publishing research on military physiology that was respected in its field and read by specialists. His post-war publications did not address Pervitin or the wartime use of stimulants. He gave no recorded interviews on the subject. The 1940 memo was found in his personal papers after his death and reached archivists in the mid-1960s. When West German authorities finally moved to restrict methamphetamine in 1967, 30 years after Temmler first placed it on pharmacy shelves, the legislative debate made almost no reference to the wartime experience. The restriction was driven by contemporary concerns about recreational misuse among young people, by alignment with international drug control frameworks being developed through the United Nations, and by accumulating clinical data from post-war research. The war's pharmaceutical history was not a prominent feature of the discussion. The generation that had lived through it was still alive. Most of them didn't speak about it. Theodore Morell died in May 1948 in an American internment facility in Tegernsee, Bavaria. He had been held for 3 years pending a determination of whether he should be prosecuted at Nuremberg. The determination was ultimately that he was not a major war criminal, a physician who had treated a patient using methods that were unorthodox but not, under the legal definitions applied, criminal. He was released in late 1947 and died several months later of a stroke. He was 62 years old. He gave one extended interview during his internment to an American intelligence officer. In it, he described his treatment of Hitler in terms that consistently emphasized the legitimacy of his methods and the difficulty of managing a patient who refused to follow medical guidance. He described the stimulant preparations as standard therapeutic compounds used within accepted parameters. He did not address the dosing escalation documented in his own diaries. He may not have been asked about it directly. The interview transcript, like the diaries, was classified and filed. What remained, after all the deaths and the silences and the filed documents and the reorganized companies, was the molecule itself, unchanged, still synthesizable from precursor chemicals that remained available, still producing the same effects in human neurochemistry that Friedrich Hauschild had observed in his Tempelhof laboratory in 1937, still waiting, as molecules don't wait but this one seemed to, for the next era's version of the problem it had always been offered as the solution to. In laboratories across the United States and Europe in the 1950s and 1960s, methamphetamine was being researched, prescribed, and marketed under new names for new patient populations. The wartime data, the dependency rates, the psychiatric presentations, the cardiac events, the falsified supply records, the 63 names in a damaged notebook under a floorboard in Kirchzarten, was not part of those researchers' frame of reference. They were starting as each generation does from what they knew. The question of what they were starting was one that the previous generation had answered. The answer was in the archives. The archives were extensive, cross-referenced, and almost entirely unread. Whether anyone would read them before the next version of this story began was a question that 1967 had not answered, and 1980 had not answered, and the decades after that had not answered either. The drawer was open. The memo was there. Return to May 1940 for a moment. Not to the strategy, not to the maps, not to the generals making decisions in fortified rooms far from the sound of engines. Return to a specific truck moving through the Ardennes forest at 2 a.m, canvas roof, red cross on the side, a 27-year-old physician sitting in the back with a medical kit between his knees and a tin of white tablets in his coat pocket. The trees pressing close on both sides of the road. The column moving without lights to avoid aerial detection. Somewhere ahead, the sound of armour. Somewhere behind, more of the same. Ernst Langen sitting in that darkness, awake on his fourth consecutive night, feeling not exhausted but purposeful, clear and capable, and certain that the clarity was simply who he was under pressure, not something borrowed from a small white pill he had swallowed 6 hours earlier. That moment, that specific, unremarkable moment of a man who didn't know what he didn't know. Now hold that image and place next to it a different one. A tin box under the floorboards of a rented room in Kirchzarten, 1962. Langen is 49 years old. He walks in the forest every morning and returns to his 2 rooms and reads and occasionally writes, though not the notebook. The notebook stays in its tin. The tin stays under the floor. He has developed the habits of a man who has decided that a quiet life is not a consolation prize but a considered choice. He buys bread from the same bakery every Tuesday. He knows the hardware store owner's children by name. He looks, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. Inside the tin, the notebook holds 63 names. 63 men whose psychiatric collapses, cardiac events, paranoid breaks, and silent deteriorations he documented across 2 campaigns in a document that no medical authority ever read. The notebook also holds his own story, the 19 months of daily use, the withdrawal in a Soviet camp, the careful self-observation of a physician who turned his clinical training on himself because there was no one else to do it. The 2 images, the truck in the Ardennes and the tin under the floor, are connected by a single molecule, the same one that Friedrich Hauschild pressed into a tablet in a Tempelhof laboratory in 1937, the same one Morel drew into a needle in a Berlin office in 1941, the same one Clara Brenner swallowed with her morning water for 14 years, while her husband swallowed the same thing 200 kilometers east of her, and neither of them discussed it, and both of them believed, for a very long time, that the only thing the pill was doing was helping. The numbers, assembled across the entire arc of the war, require a moment of stillness to absorb properly. Between 1939 and 1945, an estimated 200 million doses of Pervitin and its derivative preparations were consumed by German military personnel across all branches and theatres of the war. This figure, reconstructed by historians from partial supply records, transport manifests, and the kind of forensic arithmetic that logistics documents enable, even when they were designed to obscure, represents a conservative estimate. The actual number is likely higher. It incorporates only documented military consumption. The civilian figures, which continued throughout the war period, are largely irrecoverable. 200 million doses, 1 molecule, 6 years. The Ardennes column was 35 million of those doses, the number that opened this story. It is now possible to see that number differently, not as the full scale of the thing, but as the opening installment. The first chapter of a pharmacological project that ran across an entire continent for half a decade, bending the limits of human endurance, reshaping the decisions of the most powerful man in Europe, running through the kitchen shelves of housewives in Munich and the medical kits of physicians in Soviet prison camps, and ending not with a policy decision or a court judgment, but with supply chains failing and bodies crashing simultaneously across the geography of a collapsing empire. In the spring of 1945, as the last Pervitin shipments failed to reach frontline units, as the Temmler factory sat damaged and understaffed in a bombed-out district of Berlin, as Morel prepared his final injections and Langen sat in a Soviet collection facility, and Clara Brenner arranged her husband's funeral with 2 pills and absolute composure, in all of those simultaneous moments the molecule itself was entirely unaffected. It didn't end with the Reich. It didn't surrender with the Wehrmacht. It wasn't tried at Nuremberg or classified in an archive or restructured through corporate reorganization. It existed in the world the same way it always had, as a chemical property, a specific arrangement of carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen atoms that interacted with human neurochemistry in ways that were absolutely consistent and absolutely indifferent to the uses they were put to. Friedrich Hauschild's 1937 synthesis was not unique. The molecule had been known since 1893. It would be re-synthesized in laboratories in Japan, in the United States, in Mexico, in China, each time by chemists who were not thinking about the Ardennes or Stauffenberg's briefcase, or a physician's notebook under a black forest floor. Each time for a new application, a new population, a new version of the same original problem. Human beings wanted to feel more capable than their bodies allowed, and here was a compound that reliably produced that feeling. The feeling was always borrowed. The bill always came. Today, methamphetamine is the second most widely consumed illegal substance on Earth. Global seizures of the drug run to hundreds of tons annually. In parts of Southeast Asia, it circulates in tablet form, pressed into small pills, sold in quantities that suggest industrial production, a detail that carries a specific resonance for anyone who's been paying attention to this story, because the method of delivery, the scale of distribution, and the population of users who believe they are managing a problem rather than creating one are not so different from what a German pharmacist stocked on his shelves in 1938. The molecule in those pills is identical to what Hauschild synthesized, identical to what Morel drew into his needle, identical to what Langen distributed from a Red Cross truck moving through the dark Ardennes forest on 3 days without sleep. The tin has changed. The label has changed. The explanation for why it makes sense, why it's necessary, why the person taking it is different from the cautionary story they've heard about other people who took it, that explanation has changed in its particulars with every era and remained identical in its structure. Clara Brenner's daughter, in a conversation her mother initiated without apparent premeditation one evening in 1971, heard the following account: that her mother had taken a pill every day for 14 years, that the pill had made things manageable when manageable seemed impossible, that stopping it had been the hardest thing she had done in a life that had contained genuinely hard things, and that she had never once, not once in 14 years, been told by a physician what the pill actually was. The daughter was 33 years old at the time. She was a secondary school teacher in Freiburg. She listened to her mother describe those 14 years with the specific attention of someone filing information they understand will matter later. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. What she thought, recorded nowhere, reconstructed from nothing, existing only as the reasonable inference available to any person who's been listening to this story from the beginning, is that a small white pill in a tin on a kitchen shelf in Munich in 1938 had reached, through her father's death and her mother's 14 years, and the whole enormous machinery of a world war, all the way to a conversation in a living room in Freiburg in 1971, and that the pill had been gone for 19 years by then, and that the conversation was still happening. Ernst Langen died in Kirchzarten in 1978. He was 65 years old. A neighbour found him on a Wednesday morning when he failed to appear at the bakery, a routine so consistent across 16 years that its interruption registered as information. He had died in his sleep, of a heart condition diagnosed 4 years earlier and managed without drama, the way he managed most things. The hardware store owner's son, who had known Langen since childhood, was asked to clear the room. He found the 2-room apartment almost entirely bare of personal material, no photographs, few books, no correspondence worth keeping. Under the floorboards of the smaller room, he found a tin box. Inside the box was a notebook with a broken spine and water-damaged pages covered in small, precise handwriting. He couldn't read the medical notation. He didn't know what it recorded. He placed it in a box of Langen's effects that went, eventually, to a municipal archive that processed unclaimed personal documents. The notebook is there now, catalogued, preserved, largely unread. 63 names in a dead man's handwriting, 63 entries documenting what a molecule does when it is given to human beings in unlimited quantities without their full understanding and without adequate consideration of what happens when it stops. The answer is in the archive. It has always been in the archive. The question is whether the next era will read it before it needs to, or only after.